Welcome to Initiation into Mystery, our discussion of the 15 mysteries of the Rosary. Today we're going to be talking about the first sorrowful mystery, the Agony in the Garden, and we'll be getting going in a few minutes. We'll wait to see some people signing on. I hope people can join us. Please feel free to ask any questions or share stories. This video will remain available and we'll continue to check the conversation and return to it over the next couple of days.
So, the Agony of the Garden, what fun.
Before we get started, I want to talk. I realize that there's something that Clark and I do with the mysteries, and I wanted to invite everybody to do it with us. And we've talked about learning about the mystery, exploring the folk legends of the mystery, and about bringing your own imagination and personal experience to it. But one of the really important things you can do with the mysteries is ask them questions. You know, we're often taught not to ask questions in religious settings.
Yeah.
And what really you do with a mystery religion is you ask a lot of questions. You question everything. Don't take anything for granted. Any detail can
Yeah,
be
no
questioned.
detail is too small. I mean, they're all I've been writing on Way of the Rose about the quote strange tells hidden in the actual physical artifact of the rosary. Well, the mysteries are like this too. They often contain, sometimes it's in the art, sometimes it's in the actual text of the scripture, sometimes it's in the folklore associated with it. Sometimes it just, sort of comes out of the ether and out of the air at you, and you go, wow, why did I have that thought? Like,
Or
what's that
why
association
is
about?
that going on? How come
Yeah,
they're saying that? What's really going on here? So
yeah,
that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to look at the first sorrowful mysteries, and it feels like a big moment to be entering into the sorrowful mysteries, which I personally always think of as the sorrows of empire.
right,
This is, Clark always says, the first set of mysteries extends over 13 years,
right,
and the next set of mysteries extends over 24 hours.
right.
They're
It,
very
it's a, it's a
fast.
very it's a acceleration of time, and if you look at it, if you think of the five joyful mysteries, as we often have on Way of the Rose, as sort of the history of our species, going back through deep time, through the upper lower Paleolithic, then it corresponds to about the amount of time there have been hominids, actually, right? If you take those 13 years as compared to a 24-hour period, 24-hour period on that scale is about the length of time that human beings have been practicing agriculture in empire.
And let me talk a little bit about that because there was a comment about that earlier today about agriculture and
Yeah,
empire. It's not something that's often taught in the history books. There's some very interesting books you can read about it. It's something
yeah,
that's fascinated both Clark and me, which is
yeah,
kind of, we're taught that, people began to create cities and progress began
right.
and they developed counting and the
Just a
alphabet.
standard like fourth grade, American triumphalist, a textbook you had in grade school. They just talked about the March of Progress.
The march, and
Right.
the and Babylon, on to Egypt, and onward, bigger, better.
As if there were no slavery, as if there were no oppression, as if there were no pandemics or plagues
All of which are
or
what are in.
dirt or germs or anything that resulted from living on such a large scale.
What's clear is post after the ice ages, there is a 8,000 year period, a 10,000 year period.
Called, not coincidentally, the Magdalenian era, the period right before agriculture, has the name of Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, and it was an era when people had all of the benefits of what we think of as civilization, the benefits of culture. They had
Yeah.
music, they had art, they had
Hmm.
creativity, um, but
Dance,
they were still hunters and
storytelling.
gatherers. They
Yeah.
didn't live in one place. What
Yeah.
they did is they followed the herds and they followed the seasons of plants, eating whatever the earth had to offer in that
Right.
time
Right.
period.
The earth fed them, and there is very little conflict of any kind. There's really no record of warfare or anything like that.
And then human beings begin to settle down. They stop moving, they stop following the herds, they stop following the seasons, and they start to plant their own food.
Hmm.
And what eventually happens is they start to grow singular crops,
Yeah.
barley,
Monocultures.
wheat, and they create monocultures. And what happens when they create monocultures, or all of what we
It's the
consider.
same thing. It's the same thing that happens when you have large groups of people all living together. You invite pestilence and plague. You invite all kinds of difficulties and internal contradictions that don't show themselves in the permaculture of nature, right?
And so a lot of the problems we consider the problems we live with, particularly pandemics,
Yeah,
violence,
yeah.
slavery,
Hmm.
misogyny,
Economic inequity.
emerge with agriculture, because what happens is you need a class of people who's willing to work all the time. In hunter-gatherer cultures, people, everybody works about an hour or two a day. Nobody
Right.
really works that hard.
Well, and you also need to make people work really hard. And suddenly you have, once you have slave drivers. Once you have laws, you have police. Once we begin to live on a scale like that together in large cities or towns, suddenly all kinds of things become necessary. And with each new, quote, advance comes a whole new set of problems, which then have to be solved. Those solutions lead to other
You
problems
need
and
more
higher
land.
levels of
You destroy
complexity.
the land, you need to take over more land. And then you
Yeah,
need to enslave the people in that new
yeah.
land to make that land fertile for you.
We don't need to, but it becomes kind of the inevitable path of least resistance, as the populations grow and the demands of those, the consumption demands of those populations grow.
So I think of these as the sorrows of empire.
Yeah,
And here we are. We're entering the sorrows of empire. What's actually happening in the story is the Romans have colonized Palestine. They have suppressed the people. They've brought in soldiers. They've instituted a terror campaign.
yeah.
About 20 years before the time of Jesus, they have crucified 200 people outside of
I think more
Jerusalem.
than that. Yeah,
It was one day they did it,
that.
200 people, men, women,
Yeah,
and children
yeah,
outside the city. So it's a terror campaign. There's a policy of suppressing the
yeah,
locals. All violence has to be subdued, and it's all in the name of, as empires always imagine themselves as bringing order and justice to
yeah,
communities.
yeah. So Brant Stickley said, "How did you go bankrupt?" He quoted Hemingway. Is it Hemingway or is it? It's either Hemingway or
It's Hemingway, honey.
is it? How did you go bankrupt? And the answer is slowly at first, and then all at once, all of a
And
sudden.
that's really what agriculture happens.
Yeah,
It's slow in the beginning, and then it snowballs, and it's where we
yeah,
find ourselves today. And
yeah,
Jesus is the proponent of the hunter gatherer lifestyle.
yeah.
He says, give us this day our daily bread, live like the lilies of the field.
His disciples are criticized for walking through a wheat field. In one of the episodes in the Gospels, his disciples are criticized for walking through a wheat field and reaching their hands out and getting the raw wheat off of the stalk and then eating it and munching it as they go along. They're basically practicing a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And the disciples are criticized for, quote, working on the Sabbath. And Jesus says basically, this is
We're eating, we're not
ridiculous. We're
working.
eating. We're not working. We're living. This is what life is.
And that's what the hunter gatherers would have said. We said we don't work.
Yeah.
But so we have this moment, and let's look at it. This is the Jesus. We're going to just look at this mystery. It's the night after the Last Supper, after the Passover Seder, and Jesus and his disciples are in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus asks his disciples to stay awake with him
Yeah.
through the night,
Yeah.
and they all fall asleep.
Right. And he keeps trying to wake them up, but they fall back asleep.
And they keep falling back asleep.
Yeah.
And Jesus famously prays to his Father, to God, and says,
Let this cup pass from me if it be your will. If not, then thy will, not mine, be done.
which we're really going to take a look at.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, of course, in the morning, the Roman Empire will arrive and arrest Jesus.
Yeah.
So there's this moment, and I think that the first thing I would say is we're in a garden.
Hmm.
We are in a garden, and I think it's really that's the most powerful thing to see. We're in this transitional moment of
Hmm.
empire. The garden still exists.
Yeah.
We're not yet in the completely urbanized. There's a moment he's out. It's the garden in a city, but it's still there. It's still the
Yeah.
natural world.
Kind of the edge of the city. It's really a liminal space. The Garden of Gethsemane. It's a place at that time. Now, of course, the whole thing is urbanized, but uh, there is a space that lies, between the world that Jesus has preached about, right? The world of people who live from one day to day without accumulating surpluses, depending on the earth to feed them and the goodwill of their in their own hearts and of their fellow human beings to sustain them and protect them and nurture them and support them. And between that world and the city is this garden, and that's where he's at. He goes there, as is his habit, to pray in the middle of the night. He's just doing what he's been doing his whole career. He's constantly referred to as, waking up before the others or going to bed before the others, going out alone to pray. Disciples are there with him. They know something's coming, and there's a really interesting line in Luke where it describes this. It says two things. One is that he was so upset that he sweat blood, that drops of blood fell, came from his sweat. And if you think about the agony in the garden, I've always said, well, okay, so he's there. How different is it from a criminal like awaiting execution, right? I mean, that's basically, how he's being described. And really, it isn't, right? This is something that a lot of people have experienced. So there's this sort of dramatizing of it, the sweating of blood, to make it seem more more intense than it is. But it says of his disciples that they slept for sorrow, and they can't face the sorrow, right? They can't tolerate the thought of what's coming. They can't look at it. They're unwilling to look at it, and so instead they fall asleep.
And it's a really pivotal moment. I mean, I think
Yeah,
there's a moment. Everyone's had a moment where they've been up late at night and they
yeah,
said, "Oh, things are about to go down. Things are bad. I know bad things are
yeah,
coming."
yeah. It's a universal experience. We've all been there.
That agony and the dark, the agony of the soul, the dark night of the soul,
Yeah,
is it is a completely relatable moment. And but
yeah,
there also, the horror is that when you cannot share that experience with other
yeah.
people, when they don't see what's coming.
Yeah. So that's, I think, a good way to, sort of circle back on what we were talking about earlier. We find ourselves right now at a critical moment in history when Our Lady is asking us to pray the rosary, right? Part of the reason she's asking us to pray it is so that we can
Be awake
learn
in the garden.
how to be awake, to stay awake in the garden, right? I mean, think about the past, the pandemic has, woken a lot of people up who are sleeping, people who are still sleeping in the midst of it, right? Pretending it can't happen. I don't think that they're doing that honestly out of complete ignorance. I think they're doing it out of sorrow. They don't know how to metabolize that much sorrow. They don't know what to do with it.
I mean, certainly one of the things that's been very exciting for Clark and me is to be in the way of the rose, is to be in the garden with people who are awake.
That's right.
And there is something like, there's a moment of relief of like,
Yeah.
oh, we can talk about climate change. Clark and I have been talking about climate change for 30 years, and our family rolled their eyes at us. And even now we keep trying to say,
Not my
look,
brother. My
no,
brother didn't
no,
roll
not
his
your
eyes.
brother.
My
Clark's
brother
brother's
gave us the idea.
he's a population
population geneticist. He's been talking about COVID-19 since he came out of the womb.
um, and and yet it's also possible and important with every mystery, I think, not to become fixated on a single character, because the invitation here is to look in our own lives and to say, where am I asleep?
Right.
Where do I not want to open my eyes?
Yeah.
Who's asking me to wake up and sit with them with the hardest knowledge in the world? And how do I do that? They're not,
Yeah.
all they're asking me to do is to open my
Yeah.
eyes.
And there's something I thought about today. Perdita has been talking about asking yourself questions. I asked myself a question today I'd never asked about this mystery. And I asked myself, well, what is to be gained from staying awake? Like, isn't there some, way in which, the disciples sort of like sleeping through it? I mean, we've always kind of admired people who just fall asleep in the midst of crisis, right? And just, rest and get a little shut eye. Sometimes that's what you need, and it's hard to do. There are people who can do that. Jesus stays awake. What's the prize of that? And I had a startling answer to that question. I thought the prize of it is resurrection. He experiences resurrection. He's willing to face the sorrow and to pass willingly through the sorrow and to remain awake through it. And the prize of that is resurrection. The disciples, you know, we don't get that from the disciples' stories. You
I
know,
also want
they.
to describe something even more radical here. And I want to say that this is our first mystery with no women in it.
Mm,
And our first sorrowful mystery has a complete absence of the female presence. There are no women. It's the male disciples. There are no women mentioned.
mm,
There will be women mentioned in the mysteries to come, but not this one.
yeah.
And this is a world. Jesus has found himself in a world with only men, and his mother isn't there. She's not even there in his prayers. It's the prayer to the Father, and it's all about will and power and who's got
Yeah.
power and who's in charge and what has to happen. And I just have this feeling as a woman, like if there were a group of women there, if everybody's wives were there, they would say, "Get out now." If mom was there, she'd say, "Put on your shoes and get moving. We're out of
Yeah.
Jerusalem. We don't have to
Right.
stay in the city.
Right.
Leave the city.
Right.
Out of here." But
Right.
no, that's not what happens. This is a world without women and
Yeah.
without a female perspective. And it's a world that's on the edge of horrific violence.
It is the 24 hours of the sorrowful mysteries represent a world in which women are not present for some of the mysteries. They're present for most of them
But
or
they're
some
not
of them.
participatory.
Well, they are even participatory in some cases, but they're not powerful. They have no power. It's as if their all of their power has been denied them. And if we look historically at what has happened from agriculture on, women have experienced a steady lessening of their power. They've experienced a disempowering.
And Jesus has brought a message of the hunter gatherer to a people
Mm,
already deeply committed to civilization.
yeah.
It's already a radical message. It's already there's very very little of that hunter gatherer lifestyle left.
No, his preaching is unfamiliar. The fact that Jesus' teaching is unfamiliar to the people of his day and seems fresh and new is a sign of how far they've drifted from their natural inclinations and their
and
natural wisdom.
and it's what we're seeing. This I call the sorrowful mysteries, or the sorrows of patriarchy and the sorrows of civilization.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been feeling a lot right now, like I've been reading the news, and as I'm sure a lot of people have, and just feeling this horror and this heartbreak at all of the monstrosities that are happening by our police force. I mean, every police officer, I'm sure every Roman soldier is convinced of his moral righteousness. He's on this right side. He's part of the empire. The
Mm.
emperor, the empire, the Romans are the good guys. These are the rebels.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and I think that's the problem, is the danger is when we become convinced of the goodness of empire itself. And I realized, I kept thinking, what do I want? I said, I want the end of empire. I
Mm.
want the end of that kind of nationalistic insanity.
Yeah, but I think it's important to realize, like you talked about, our willingness to enter into any of the roles. Like, we can become a policeman at any moment,
Yeah.
right? It's not just like a role, right? And you could become the policeman who gets a cat out of a tree, or who helps somebody, who locked their keys in their car. Or you can be the policeman who sees a black man, like in Central Park bird watching and calls the cops on him, right? I mean, these sorts of things happen. People will occupy that place where they are enforcing stereotypes, racial prejudice, economic inequity, and it all comes down to like fear. Some fear descends upon us, and we respond in that way. Like the soldiers are told to go and arrest Jesus, and even the ones who know that this is wrong, and even the ones who've heard him preach, and a number of them have. We hear in the Gospels that a number of these people have actually come to him for advice, right? So they know that there's something wrong here, but they feel compelled to participate in it.
And and Kelly says here in the agony in the garden in Minneapolis, exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. And the horror is, I'm sure there were many nights before that night that
yeah,
that man woke up and knew that he was living in a world that was violent and out to get him.
yeah,
And and what does it mean? And what does it mean to be asleep to the amount of violence that's occurring in our
yeah,
world at every moment?
yeah.
In what ways are we asleep to violence? How do we wake up to
Mm,
it? But the thing is, what we're about to witness is the ways that empire exacts violence on the whole earth.
right.
If we see the garden if we Connor says that the theater of the oppressed, that's Paulo Freire, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Our Everything in our culture is designed about oppression.
Yeah.
We we oppress the land. We force the land into a state of constant
Mm,
fertility.
mm,
And similarly, we force women into a state of constant fertility.
right.
And what erupts? Slavery,
Mm,
misogyny,
mm,
war,
yeah.
colonialism.
Mm,
And it's all interconnected.
yeah.
It all starts with both the domestication of animals and the domestication of plants.
Mm.
Both both are violent.
We live under what sociologists called dominance hierarchies, right? Where authority is administered from above, right, rather than cooperation administered from below. And even in the Bible, one of the first commandment given by God in the Bible is, be fruitful and multiply and have dominion over the creatures of the air and the birds of the field, right? And that dominion, that dominance becomes the de facto style for human beings, or de facto strategy in just about everything. So these early scriptures are a record of what actually happens. The Garden of Eden, we always say, well, Eve ate the apple and all that sort of stuff. We get stuck in the narrative. But the portrait that it's painting is actually a description of what happened, right? We gave
And
up
here we are
living
back
off the land and decided to oppress one another.
and here we are back in the garden. And Jesus is in the garden. And don't take it for granted.
It's the same garden.
It's the same garden and it's always available to
Yeah.
us. We can always, what does it mean to return to the garden? I mean, I'm going to do 9 days on Our Lady of Woodstock, and I always think of, Joni's great song about Woodstock, we've got to get back to the garden.
Yeah.
And how do we get back to the garden but not have the soldiers coming
Mm,
and not have a battle of wills with the Father?
mm,
And I just want to talk about that battle of wills because a lot of times when people talk about prayer, they refer to this mystery
mm.
and they say, you know, not my will, but thy will be done, God. And they abdicate the desire for their own heart's
Right.
desire.
Right.
I wanted to say to Jesus, what do you want right now? You want this? You want to die at the hands of these idiot soldiers? Or are we going to get you out of Jerusalem? Because I got a group of women over there who want to put you on a donkey and get you out. And we got a nice girl who loves you, who's married to you, and you can go have babies.
Right.
That's what I want to say. Get
Mm,
out. And and we've got to begin to imagine our way out of the story of
mm,
empire.
mm,
How do we bring a different telling to this story?
mm.
I mean, I find that there's a very complicated, almost pornographic relationship to the sorrowful mysteries, as if there are somehow a good thing, that we
Right.
are watching the slow torture and murder of this man, and it's what's supposed to happen. It's a good thing. And that has been used to enforce slavery and violence around the
Yeah,
world, and it has to
misogyny and
stop.
anti-Semitism and all of that.
It
Yeah.
has been used and misused. I'm a mama in this story, and this mama says, "Stop." No will. No more discussion about will. Let's start talking about getting out of here now tonight.
But that question of will. I mean, I think that line is misused a great deal. But think about the Our Father. It's a beautiful part of the prayer that says, "Thy kingdom come, Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Now, this is just a restatement of a very, very ancient principle that goes all the way back through sacred geometry, Hermeticism. Later on, it reveals itself through the tarot. It's used in Wicca nowadays, as above, so below. That there is an order, right, that is reflected in the heavens and it's reflected in the earth, and it's a natural order that we can revert to. It's the order of the garden that Perdita talks to. It's always there. We can always release our own need for power or dominance to that larger world and let Our Lady work through us and work around us in nature. And the moment we do that, we find that the world is incredibly generous and loving and kind, and that the cycles of the seasons even are redemptive.
A redemptive. I mean, Lynn Lu says dominion is different than stewardship, and
Oh
I
yeah.
really recommend the book Braiding Sweetgrass, which is one of the most revelatory books
Mm,
I've ever read by Robin Kimmerer. And it's about the collaboration with nature. That human beings need to collaborate with nature. That there are many plants and animals that do better and thrive more in collaboration
yeah.
when we're
Yeah.
eating them, when we're enjoying them. So that it doesn't mean that we just have to remove ourselves, but we have to learn how to be friends again with the earth.
Mm.
I think Jesus was a friend of the earth. I think he knew how to be a friend. But
His
this is
teachings are certainly just, they're ecologically framed, all of them. He didn't have to teach that way. Rabbis didn't teach that way during Jesus' day.
no.
He's very distinctive in this. Takes the teachings of the country and tries to bring them to the city.
And he's a country boy. He's not a
Yeah,
city boy. He is an illiterate country boy. And he's a boy who knows nature, and he knows the plants, he knows the animals. He's a storyteller. He's a Megid. He's a shaman.
yeah,
And if we think of him as a shaman, um, at this moment, and he see like a lot of shamans, he sees what's coming.
yeah.
And I think of those people. I think of the shamans who saw what was coming before Columbus's arrival in America.
Yeah, or the the shamans that are part of the Pachamama movement that began
Absolutely.
having dreams years and years before the arrival in the Amazon of the first bulldozers, right? And their shamans began having dreams about the destruction of their people at the hands of the whole world. And they didn't know what to do with these dreams. And then the first bulldozers arrived, and they decided to send their shamans out on missions around the world to talk to people, to try to explain that if you don't take care of the earth, it will destroy you, right? That was their message.
My heart breaks, and that's
Yeah.
my heart breaks. I think our invitation here is not to see Jesus as a
Mm.
singularity, but to
Yeah.
see this story everywhere we look. If we
Yeah.
treat it as a singularity, we miss where it's
Yeah.
happening all around
Jesus is
us.
on death row. Jesus is, having the air choked out of him. Jesus is, he is experiencing what many people experience. People experience it quickly, suddenly, decisively, or they experience it slowly. I mean, some people's, like agony in the garden goes on for years. For some people, it feels like their whole life is the agony in the garden. There are people who suffer
and
like that.
and and our responsibility is to wake up and be there with them and
Yeah,
to talk about it, because maybe there's a different solution if we all wake up.
right.
That is, I think, finally where I get to with this. And I feel like as we journey through the sorrowful mysteries, there's a part of me that prays that my grandchildren are telling a different story
Mm,
when we get to the
mm,
sorrowful
mm,
mysteries.
mm.
um I don't know. I think about those people in the Amazon, and I just want to weep. And I don't know. I can go on, but
Yeah, yeah,
um, they're heavy. I think the one thing I will say is the Rosary prepares us to wake up with Jesus there in the garden. It demands every 3 days that we walk through these sorrowful mysteries.
yeah,
We are not allowed to bliss out and pretend violence is not happening in the world.
yeah. And exactly. But the Rosary teaches us how to pass through sorrow,
It
and it
does.
passes us. It teaches us how to pass consciously through sorrow, right? With our eyes open, our ears open, and with our hands held out for to people to hold hands with as we pass through. We don't pass through it alone. I think the loneliness of Jesus in the garden is. Nowadays I think of it as a kind of an object lesson. It's like a warning. Don't do this. Don't do this to another person. Don't fall asleep with a person that's suffering. And don't also, to the person who suffers, don't suffer alone. Reach out to somebody, shake someone awake. Jesus does that in the story. He shakes the disciples awake again and
But
again.
he needed a woman there. Why isn't Mary Magdalene there? You will have to read our daughter's book to find out. Prayers,
Are you
everyone.
really going to do an infomercial?
I am. It's so good.
All right, it hasn't been published yet, so okay.
It hasn't
This
been
doesn't
published.
qualify as advertising. But it's true. She really handles
She
it
really
beautifully.
handles it. And somebody
Yeah.
said, what about Nicodemus earlier? And the character of Nicodemus is so beautifully done and
Yeah.
so beautifully realized.
Yeah.
And all of the characters at this moment in
Yeah.
the garden. But why aren't Mary Magdalene and Jesus together? I talked about asking questions of the mysteries. Where are the women in the story? What happened to them?
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's it for tonight. Thank
Yeah.
you,
That's it.
everybody.
Thanks,
We will
everybody.
be back next week. I've had right beside me. I think I just have to share because we've talked about sorrow tonight, but I have had just, I don't know if everybody can see, but right beside us.
This is an absurd thing. This is just an absurd thing.
Can everybody see this? It's
He
a
doesn't
cat in a
he
box.
doesn't like the sorrowful mystery, so he just climbed on the box and he's hiding his head. He's not asleep, technically.
He's the best cat that ever lived. I'm just saying. And this is his moment of stardom. I'm just putting him out there, but he's
But he's going
hiding.
to
He's
be
being
famous.
very
And
shy.
now he decides he's not ready. He hasn't signed a release for him.
No, he hasn't. All right, everybody. Thank you so
All
much.
right. Bye bye.
Love you. Bye bye.
Right there.